Welcome to Jammin' with Jason Mefford, a show where we discuss topics relevant to chief audit executives and professionals in audit, risk, and compliance. We discuss the technical and soft skills needed to navigate the minefields of organizations. You hear best practices and practical advice for helping you advance your career, and we'll even talk about music, mindfulness, and psychology, because we can. So sit back and relax while you listen to the #1 podcast in the world for internal auditors, unscripted and unedited. Hey, welcome everybody. I am excited to be here today with Colleen Knuft from Wolters Kluwer TeamMate. So Colleen, welcome, because I don't think people have any idea of what they're about to get themselves into now, but I'm really excited to talk with you about some of the research that you've been doing. So maybe just introduce yourself and let's start talking a little bit about the research, and then we'll just jump in and have a conversation here, because I know from what we've talked about already, some pretty interesting results.
Sure. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, so I head up the global product management team for TeamMate at Wolters Kluwer. And I started my career as an internal auditor. I worked for a life and health insurance company, and I bounced around a little bit. I started off as like the baby junior auditor inside the department. I was, a college grad. And then I moved into IT audit, and I helped with, you remember like the year 2000, kind of that whole thing. I got involved in that, did a little bit of time in a fraud group. And then eventually I graduated from college with a minor in computer science, and that kind of drew me in. So I switched gears, and I decided that I could advocate and develop product for internal auditors, and that was really where my calling was. So I've been doing that for about 20 years. That's how I got involved with TeamMate. So in advocating on behalf of customers, one of my jobs is obviously to learn about what's going on in the space. And I have always maintained my internal audit designations. And so, going to conferences and continuing that, that learning path, because I'm a big believer in continuous learning as well. I can't sit still because world will pass you by.
Go lifelong learners, lifelong learners.
So, in doing all of that, it occurred to me that you constantly have to, if you're not constantly learning, then you're constantly researching. And so at the beginning of this year, we decided that we wanted to really sort of launch a big survey that would give us a sense of what was going on in the internal audit profession. So we called it the Touchstone Research for Internal Audit, and we kicked that off in early January. And at the time, we just thought, okay, we're going to do a survey. We'll publish a couple of reports. It'll help us figure out where our roadmap needs to go. But it was kind of amazing. It sort of expanded and grew much bigger than we anticipated that it would. And it's not exactly like it's a quick and dirty kind of thing to take. So it's an 89 question survey. And when you're all done the survey, you will get back a map to where your organization sits on a maturity model that we have developed. And then you also get a set of benchmarks. So you'll understand how your team performed against the full survey results, your industry, your geography, and your team size. So, that information can be used to sort of benchmark, where you are at this point in time. The really unique thing, and the reason we've kept it open so long, is we had about 600 responses by early March, so the very beginning of the pandemic. And so we thought with 600 responses, we knew where the trends for the next 12 to 24 months were going to go with internal audit. And then as March rolled out and we went into April and teams all moved to remote work and trying to adjust their audit plans and going through that whole exercise, we just saw these results shifting significantly. And so we kept the survey open because it's just been this interesting study on, what you think you're going to do versus what you're actually going to do when something, significant in your world changes. And so the study itself is actually still open. And to date, we have over 1,100 responses from internal audit teams in over 120 countries. So it's pretty broad-based. It covers 13 sort of operational components or work processes across internal audit. So we weren't focusing necessarily on tool usage, which some people might think because, I do represent TeamMate, but rather the processes and the methodologies that internal auditors are doing in their day-to-day lives.
Well, so this is because I want to get into some of those things, right? Because again, like you said, you guys, from March, you had a pretty good, 600 people, pretty good data points to be able to help you see what's happening. And then this little thing happened, right? And suddenly the world shifts.
The world shifted hugely.
Surprise, surprise, right? All of you
Yeah.
auditors out there, you should have realized this, right? Once the forces change like they did back then, things are going to be different going forward. So let's jump into some of those things, because I'm interested to learn what things are different now, right? Because again, as I'm talking to people, I'm telling them, look, things are different. You know, the old traditional internal auditing, it ain't around anymore. You still may be doing it, but it's not what your organization wants or needs. So what's actually changed? What did you see kind of from some of the differences from March kind of going on?
So we saw a couple of really interesting shifts. So if you look at the totality of the results right now, there are three major places where teams are making methodology change. So one is in continuous risk assessment. Well, that got launched. That was like not really all that important, except in a couple of industries prior to March. And then suddenly everybody had to do it. And I think when you thought through this, like this labor intensive manual process that so many internal audit teams go through to create a risk assessment that informs an audit plan, and then you're being asked to like change everything, that you're still going through that labor intensive manual process, except you don't have access to management the same way you did before to ask all your questions, right? Like you can't do that because they're busy doing other things. They're trying to make sure that the company is still operating. So there was a lot of sort of shifting and adjusting, and a lot of realization by teams that this idea of an annual risk assessment. So 64% of the Touchstone respondents say they do an annual risk assessment. In tools like Excel, well, 64% of people said they did the risk assessment in Excel as well. Now, that's not the same 64% that we're doing annual, so it's not causation, maybe a little bit of correlation. But they realized that the tool set isn't all that dynamic, and it's not, you can't feed data in quickly to that. It's very manual. People were stepping over each other's, toes trying to get in there and update things, not really working. So adopting a continuous risk assessment process has certainly jumped up to be sort of that number one thing that teams want to do. The second thing,
which is a huge thing, right?
yes.
I mean, it's huge because for so long, internal audit has been ingrained in, we do an annual risk assessment. We base an annual audit plan, or sometimes 3-year audit plan, right?
Yes.
Off of this big project that we do. We spend 2 or 3 months doing it. So again, think about how efficient you're really being if you're spending 2 or 3 months doing your annual assessment. It's 2 or 3 months less of work that you're actually performing, right?
Yeah, and you're right. That average is about 3 months.
It's 2 to 3 months. Yeah,
it's 2 to 3 months. 3 months is kind of the average. And then the other thing that I think a lot of internal audit teams are starting to realize, and I think they knew it before, but it's really come to light, is that they get that plan approved and then they just move on to executing, and they never look back, right? Like they don't reevaluate. They just, so by the time you get to those audits, like towards the end of that audit plan year, like you're basing that on data that's 15 months old. Nowhere else in the business would you base decisions on data that's 15 months old.
You would not be in business any longer.
Yeah, that would be very true. And I think the other piece of feedback that a lot of them were getting is that, if you're walking into a business unit and you're like, I'm here to audit this based on this data, they look at you like you're crazy. And then they're not terribly helpful, and they're not terribly forthcoming with information because they're not seeing the value. So they're treating you a bit like a nuisance, that, one of those necessary things that has to happen, but they don't expect to get a whole lot out of it. And I think that kind of leads into the second finding a little bit, which was around adopting Agile principles. So the Agile audit movement, we knew in January and February, that was a big thing in Europe and for financial services and some bigger customers in North America. When we were talking to customers and participants in Asia-Pac, nobody was talking about Agile audit. It just wasn't a thing. We've seen that shift dramatically.
Even now in Asia-Pac as well.
Yeah, even in Asia Pacific, that thinking has shifted a lot. And when you dig into the data, it's generally around 3 things. So one is they're not very quick to respond, right? So if you think about Agile principles, right, chunk the work into smaller pieces and tell people that has to be transparent, and tell them what you're learning as you learn it. And that allows you to pivot, and it also allows the business to start taking action on things as soon as they know about it. And as we moved, early stages of the pandemic, a lot of the feedback that these teams were getting is, I don't have time for you to go off and do a 3 or 4 week audit and tell me what I need to change. as our teams go remote. Like, I need to know as you find it. I need to know what you're finding as you find it, even if you're not 100% confident on it. It's like, hey, I think I found something here. Let's have a conversation about whether we need to do more testing, or whether or not this is something that needs to be addressed. So that transparency with the business, the agility and that frequency of updates of responding back to the business and letting them know what you're finding, and then leveraging some of the work that other teams were doing, right? Those were sort of three kind of things that really kind of came out of those agile principles that we're seeing a lot of teams want to deploy. And what's interesting is it was a lot of large companies where they were like, okay, we're going to take one team and we're going to pilot it and we're going to work out all the kinks and then we're going to roll it out. And now we're seeing smaller teams are like, I can't keep doing my traditional process because it's not working right now. So what can I do to be more agile? And often that has absolutely nothing to do with a tool and everything to do with a mindset.
Well, I'm going to kind of clap right now because I'm so happy that I'm hearing this, right? Because I've been telling people for a long time to get away from the annual kind of stuff and all the time that we're wasting, because I see these two actually kind of connected, right?
Yeah.
If all of
Oh,
a
they
sudden
absolutely are.
If all of a sudden now you realize, hold it, I can't spend 2 or 3 months planning my annual audit and then have a static audit plan for the whole year. I need to now change my methodology completely to agile, which again is, I'm smiling. Everybody that's watching or that's listening, right? I'm smiling big right now because one of the problems and that's been holding people back from actually doing agile auditing is sticking to some of these traditional auditing mindsets that we have to do the annual plan. So how can we do it agile? Well, now that you finally break through that limiting belief, now it totally makes sense. So now hopefully internal audit groups will actually do agile instead of just doing things faster. They'll actually adopt the whole methodology. So yay. Okay.
Yeah.
Number one and number two.
Number one and number two. And number three, I don't think it's going to be a surprise to anybody, but it's analytics, right? And it's improving their use of analytics. And we saw that kind of broken down into sort of three different groupings. One is there's still lots of teams who don't have an analytics program at all yet. So 50% of the teams reported that they had a base analytics program underway. But this won't come as a big surprise to you either, I don't think, Jason. A large percentage of that is one or two specialists who mostly do the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
And others may join in or at least participate in some of the hypothesis, formation around things, but it's generally one or two specialists. The second layer was for that 50% who have something in place, then they're starting to look at how can we advance our program and do a bit more advanced analytics. And really that's when they start looking at different tools and different ways of doing testing, expanding out from sort of the traditional, I look at financial transactions, and they're starting to look at other controls that they can test across the organization. And then the third one, and it's still quite in its infancy, is this notion of, well, if I can do 1 and 2, can I do continuous testing? Can I start to automate these tests, particularly around routine things that they might be quote unquote continuously auditing right now, which means once a quarter they go and perform the same test, but they're still doing it manually. Let's find ways to automate that function so we can free up all these people who know the organization and help them apply their professional judgment to just different areas, right? Take that mundane routine work out of the day-to-day schedule and turn that over to, whether that's robotic process automation toolkits or, more advanced data analytics where they can, schedule things, but moving it that direction.
Yeah. Well, good. Hopefully, again, analytics is something we've been talking about for 20 years. So hopefully people are going to start actually doing something and actually doing something that is valuable.
Yeah.
So again, what I've seen a lot of times when people say that, now I have a data analytics program, they're still going back to a lot of those low risk financial numbers, testing payroll, testing AP, using data analytics, which again is probably not the highest and best use. Unless you happen to work in an organization, though, those are two of the top risks, but I haven't ever seen one that we probably spend way too much time on that area. And instead, those should be more of the first or second lines doing more of that work and start focusing our analytics on other parts of the organization that really matter more than the financial data.
Well, and the teams that we're seeing that are having some success in moving past that are taking an approach of whether it's, I'll call it borrowing somebody in your data analysis or data science group inside of your corporation, or hiring somebody onto the team. Now, there's a lot of resistance at, well, they're not auditors. Okay, well, I've done some looking around and I've looked at some of the data out there. Go onto LinkedIn and do a search for internal audit data analytics and see how many open job posts you get as an example. And then just do internal audit. So about 10% of those job postings are looking for both skill sets. And according to some Gartner research that came out last year, there's only about 3% of the employable workforce out there that actually carry both skill sets. So it's 3%. We're already looking for 10, and that doesn't include the people who are employed. Like, we're looking for a unicorn. So we should stop looking for a unicorn and start rethinking how we approach this. So teams that are bringing in a data science person, okay, they're not a magic bullet either, but they're going to know the tool sets and the types of testing that could give you a result. They just don't know what result you're looking for. So that's when you need to sit down with them, if you know your organization, and say, let's talk about testing hypothesis. So in this business unit, if let's do that exploratory and be curious thing. If I was going to commit fraud, or if I was going to work my way around the system, here's how I would go about doing it. And then figure out how the data would tell you whether or not that happens, right? Because then that's when your data scientists can go off and do their magic and come back and give you a set of results you can look at and validate whether or not what he thinks is in there is actually in there. And that sort of that working together, that coordination of effort is something that I think is really, really important going forward. You know, when we looked at at some of the results that came out of the Touchstone research, we found that sort of 53% of internal audit teams that are of any size, these kind of silo their skill sets, right? So the financial auditors sit over here, and the operational auditors sit over here, and your IT people sit over here, and your data scientists sit over here. And they might borrow from one another, but they don't really coordinate effort, and they don't actually go do work together either. And so the problem is you never learn from anyone else, right? I'm not saying that you're going to become a data scientist by sitting next to a data scientist, but you're going to learn some skills, and you're going to learn the knowledge that you can start to apply going forward. And I think, again, if you walked into anybody in an organization who has an IT department, go walk into an IT department and actually take a look at the way their teams are kind of organized. Like, they cross-pollinate skill sets, right? You'll have product people sitting next to developers, sitting next to QA, and they all work together in a huddle. They all have different skills. They all bring different skill sets and knowledge to that team. And I think that's another thing that internal audit, they're starting to reorganize themselves that way, particularly as they move to Agile, right? That's a thing they start to actually look at and evaluate. But I think more than 53%, if 53% are still organized by skill set, we're not going to learn from each other. And I think that's going to be a problem. And that learning from skill sets, I know.
Well, because as you one of the numbers I just want to highlight again for everybody who's listening for your benefit, okay? Because a couple of those numbers I think are huge for people to consider, right? And again, I mean, we talked about at the beginning, we're lifelong learners. We love doing this stuff, right? But here's a big opportunity, folks. So if you what you said was that only about 3% of the workforce has internal audit and data analytic skills combined. So both of those skills in the same person, only 3%. But there's market demand for at least 10% of the job postings that are out there. So here's a little tip, folks. You want to up-level your career, start learning about data analytics. Go take some training. As a matter of fact, I know a little training company called C-Risk Academy where we have lots of data analytics courses, right? So here's an opportunity. If there's a big gap in the job market, you want a different job, you know already there's a 7% gap in those internal audit. And I know from talking to chief audit executives, they have a hard time finding those people, right? Yeah. So if you want to invest in yourself now and go get one of those other jobs, because this is only going to get more important as we move forward too. So
yeah, because as we were talking earlier, the pandemic has been this great catalyst for a lot of things, whether we like it or not. And one of them is, as we're all working remotely, we're having to take advantage of data to do our work more and more. And so teams that don't have anybody or any skills in that area are struggling. And, because it's really hard to go do the interviews and walk around the floor and watch a process in action if you can't be next to people. And so the data is really where you're going to have to go to determine whether or not the way the process was described is actually working that way. Are our transactions actually secure, safe, are controls being followed? Are there more workarounds around the system that actually go through the system? You can tell that from the data, but you need to know what to look for in the data, and you have to be able to analyze it. So I think those skill sets are going to become really important. And a lot of internal audit teams are really going to have to up their game around their analytics play. I know you've mentioned it before. I worry too, to some extent, that as we continue to move through the pandemic, if we're not able to actually bring value to the organization, because we're not analyzing the data and we're not identifying these weaknesses, and it's the business that's finding them through, something blowing up, we have the potential to be outsourced or replaced.
What do they need us for if we're not catching it? Right.
Yeah. Well, I think another statistic that kind of, if people weren't thinking about it before, that they do need to start thinking about it is the second sort of insight. There's 2 and 3 are related, but we looked at the importance of 18 different activities, the importance to the organization, and the importance to the audit plan. So how they stack up on the audit plan. And there was a really strong correlation of IT-related activities and IT-related risks, way more important to the organization than they're getting attention on the audit plan. And the reason I say it's a double-sided coin is, for most teams, they're spending way too much time on compliance activities. And because they're spending so much time on compliance activities, the initial reaction is, well, I don't have time, or I don't have as much time to spend on IT-related risks. But when you dig into the research a little bit deeper, there's a couple of other things that come out that make you sort of question that it's all about time and and capacity. So one of them is that when we took a look at asking some questions around, if the organization came to you with a request and it was more IT related, to put it on the audit plan, what would your approach be? And 51% said they changed the scope of their audit plan to not include it, or they purposely avoid it in their audit plan, 51%, because they know they don't have the skills to conduct the work. So that we're still digging into the research much deeper to see if there's a stronger correlation. But I come back to things like knowledge bias, right? And so this is not, fully disclosed in the research, but just looking on the surface, it's like, so 51% will change the scope of their audit plan to just meet the needs of their team. And 31% will consider outsourcing. So if you came and said, oh, I need this, instead of saying, no, I don't have the skills to do that, you'll go, okay, well, I'll try to co-source or outsource or find someone to do that. 18% will look internally inside the organization for a subject matter expert who can help them, or if they have an open headcount or the ability to have an open headcount, they will go look for the skills. But 51% will just avoid it.
Well, and I think
problematic too.
It's huge problematic, right? Because, again, a lot of people are saying, the organization isn't listening to me. They're not valuing me. They don't think I'm relevant. Well, folks, here's the numbers, right? If 51% of internal audit departments, if somebody comes to them and says, can you help me with this? And they say, nope, can't do it, not going to include it on my audit plan. Already you're shooting yourself in the foot, right? Because if 50% of the requests that you get, you say, nope, not going to do it, can't do it, people are going to quit asking, and they're going to go to somebody else. And that makes you less and less and less relevant in the organization. So that's a shocking number. At least 49% are trying to do something about it.
Yes.
But if you're on that 51% that's just creating an audit plan based on your current competencies, then kind of shame on you, and not to shame you, but come on, folks, we can do better. We can do better than that.
Yeah, and I think that leads into that conversation around the digital skills, right, that we're also seeing a bit lacking. And some of our behaviors, again, are kind of addressing that. So, and I'm sure if you went out and if you looked at, I'll call them more senior positions, it doesn't have to be a chief audit executive, but some of the more senior positions inside of an internal audit team, what's the number one certification or criteria that you see listed on an internal audit job?
CPA.
Yes.
It is.
By a long shot, right? They win the race every single time. And so what we found through the research is we looked across these 1,100 organizations, and one of the questions we asked was about designations of your chief audit executive. So then we sliced and diced the information. So 48% of these internal audit teams are led by someone who's a CPA or has an accounting background, because globally it's not always a CPA, but an accounting background. And then when we looked at the correlation, so we, because we can dice the data. So then we looked at the correlation of that same mapping. And then we see that, yeah, regulatory compliance activities, risk culture, corporate financial management, like off the charts as far as importance on their audit plan, because that's where our knowledge is, right? That's what I know. That's what I'm going to focus on. And, areas like cyber vulnerabilities, data governance, data privacy, cloud solutions, even getting into things like third-party ecosystems, which isn't necessarily an IT risk, although there's a lot of IT risk associated with it. They're really pushed aside. And when you think about what gets you in the news these days, those things I just mentioned are generally the risks, right, that get you in the news these days. And then we looked at the data and we looked for chief audit executives that had an IT background. And it's only about 10%, but a lot of those IT risks are much more in line with where the organization places importance. They're doing less regulatory compliance work. They're doing less, corporate finance work. And if you go and have a conversation with some of those CAEs, they're more likely to come back and say, well, we have second line functions for that. So when we do look at how the second line functions perform their work around regulatory compliance, but we have compliance teams who are largely responsible for that. So if they're doing their job, then we just have to, sort of monitor and make sure that what they say they're doing is what they're doing. And I can actually go tackle, these IT type risks inside the organization, which are going to be much more relevant to the organization as a whole. Followed on by looking at those digital skills, right? When you look at the job applications or how they prioritize them when they go to look for new staff, those skill sets are way at the bottom of the list. And unfortunately, I think that just continues to contribute to this dichotomy.
Well, and it's interesting because, like you said, I mean, people may be familiar with confirmation bias, but like you said, this is kind of a knowledge bias in that because we know it, that's where we tend to focus our attention. But again, just because that's what we know or what we're comfortable with doesn't mean it's actually the biggest risk to your organization. So we probably shouldn't be working there anyway. And in fact, because I've worked with people within an audit for 30 years and outside, in different, and the biggest complaint that I get from people outside of internal audit about people in internal audit is, why do they just duplicate what I am doing? So you get somebody like a compliance function and they're like, why does internal audit just redo all of the work that we just did? This doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. So stop it, right? Just help audit that second line. Just make sure, know what they're doing, but focus your efforts on some of these other areas that are much more important. So it's interesting because I know, as we kind of wrap up here, because time starts getting away from us. But was interested too. I mean, we talked about some of these big shifts that you kind of saw from when you started, back in January, and then how things changed during the pandemic. I'm wondering, because were there other skill sets or competencies besides these that we talked about that all of a sudden are now much more important than they were before too?
Yeah, I mean, data analytics is the one that kind of jumps off the charts at us as being important because it fits into that top 3 methodology changes as well. But, since everyone's had to work remotely, we're looking at how can we access data? How can we automate some of this? How can we analyze, all of this, all of the processes and data and all the information that we're pulling in? How can we actually leverage data that's created by other parts of the organization? There's a couple of things that come to light. One is a good understanding of just your corporate systems and the data flows between them, which it doesn't mean you have to be an IT expert, right? Like if you understand processes and stuff, it's about documenting, like what systems do we have in our ecosystem? What feeds what comes from what? Where do we have API connections? Are they exposed to the outside? Are they not exposed to the outside, right?
What is an API connection?
Exactly,
right? If you
right?
don't know that, then yeah.
And I think that's one thing that comes to light, because if you understand them, you might actually start using them yourself. So we talked about continuous risk assessment. there were a couple of points that a lot of teams realized, like their ERM system or their ERM, staff, their department are generating data. So why aren't we using that? It doesn't mean you have to fully use it to base your audit plan off of, but it's an influencing point. And it generally tends to be a bit more current than our audit plan. So can we pull that data in for analysis? Can we pull in other data points that might make up a risk assessment formula from an ERP system or some other system? So like, let's take some of the manual stuff out of it, but you need to understand what an API is in order to use an API and understand what data you want to pull into there so that you can start to influence that activity. The other skill sets that we see coming up are the use of RPA tools. So more and more departments that I'm talking to are at least exploring the concept. And they might look at it from two different angles. One is, my company is using more RPAs to do things. So do you know how to audit them? Do you actually know where the risks are and where they, how they're using them and what you need to look for? But the flip side of it is, can I be using them? Can I actually use an RPA tool to influence part of my work, automate part of it, go get data for me, those kinds of things. And so that's another tool set that we see companies wanting to explore. And of course, there's a bunch of them out there on the market. Some of them don't require a lot of, I'll call them truly digital skills. Others require more. But exploring those. And again, when we talk about continuing education, so I'm still an internal auditor, still have my designations. I could still go out and do that work if I really wanted to. But one of the things that I realized kind of as I was going through all of this as well is it's important for those skill sets, everybody to have a base understanding of what those skill sets perform. And, you talked about C-Risk Academy, but there's all kinds of relatively inexpensive learning opportunities. I know last fall, I took a Python class. I don't think I'm actually going to develop in Python. It just makes me dangerous for my development team because I now know what questions to ask, what it's capable of, and I can explore those concepts in a lot more detail. So I'm not scared to talk about it anymore. I'm now really curious about it. Well, what about this? What about that? And I think internal audit needs to embrace that curiosity, right? So yeah, I don't think that you're going to go off and create Python scripts that are going to, automate your process entirely. But if you understand what they're capable of, then you can have a better conversation with the people that are using those. Mm-hmm. If you're a corporation or if you're, in public sector, if they're starting to be used to, internally as a way to automate work or, to do some of these artificial intelligence activities, you'll know what kinds of questions to ask.
Well, it's funny that you bring up Python because actually we were talking about that as one of the courses for C-Risk too. We actually have somebody who would do like a Python scripting course for use in data analytics and some of the stuff like that. And we thought, well, people probably aren't quite ready for that yet. But it's, again, if you don't even know what Python is, right?
Yeah.
This is where, again, folks, it's not, and move away from the old CPE mindset of I've got to have 40 hours a year and I've got to check the boxes. You don't need 440 hours. You need 400 hours a year to stay current in today's marketplace. And you don't have to be an expert in everything. But again, especially some of these areas that we were talking about, right? With continuous risk assessment, you need to be familiar with how to actually do risk assessments. You need to have a basic understanding of Agile and Agile auditing principles. You don't have to be an expert in it. But if you don't even know what Agile means, then you need to start learning about it. If you don't know anything about data analytics, if you don't know anything about, or very little about IT systems in general, what's the difference between hardware and software, and how does information security, fall into this whole thing? Well, if you don't understand some of those basic things, it's going to be hard for you in the future, right? And like you said, your research is showing that these are some of the skill sets that people have to start developing and have to start learning because they're even more important now than they were at the beginning of 2020.
Yes. Yeah. And that base knowledge is enough to get you started in many cases, because once you get over that fear of, I don't know anything about this, and you get a little bit of knowledge and you're at all curious, you'll continue to learn from that, but you'll also know how to ask subject matter experts. And I think that's the other thing that we did see a shift starting to happen in the research results is reaching back out to the business and finding subject matter experts who can help guide them a little bit more. And I think that's going to be important too. We don't have to go it alone. A lot of internal audit departments think I am an island unto myself and I must maintain my independence and I cannot use anyone else. That's not entirely true. So bring in a subject matter expert, even if it's just like, hey, can you do like, some training sessions for my team so that we get up to speed on, I don't know, network security as an example, like the base concepts and what I should know about it and how we actually as a corporation, approach network security, and then go off and do a couple of other learning courses so you can, sort of balance that out. But then you've got a much better sense from somebody who's actually doing the work inside the organization, which you may not get by going to an outside course where it's very generic. You might get a little bit more, specific feedback that's relevant to your organization.
Well, and it does a couple of things, right? Because again, I'm reminded of one of the experiences that I had in my career, right? One of the companies, we had a large chemical fertilizer division. We made tons and tons and tons and tons, millions of tons of stuff. And I went all the way through high school, college, post-secondary college without ever taking a chemistry class. Okay. So here I was, one of our major divisions was a chemical company effectively. And so again, I didn't need to have a PhD in chemical engineering, but I needed to have a basic understanding of chemistry to be able to understand the manufacturing process, what it was, what the products were that we were developing, right? So again, I reached out to a subject matter expert, one of the plant managers in one of our major plants, who was a PhD in chemical engineering. And for a day and a half, 2 days, he took me around, a couple hours here and there, and actually explained to me the chemical reactions, how we were doing this, using that catalyst to split these, molecules to capture them in this other way, and blah, 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 right? Walking me around the plant, explaining to me, showing me how you actually do it. That was some of the best learning that I ever had to be able to help me do my job, right? And again, by having some of those basic understandings of things, it makes you a better auditor. But also, I developed a relationship with that person by hanging out with them for 2 days. You think I ever had a problem with that plant and that plant manager? Absolutely not, because I actually had a relationship with the guy, right?
Yeah. Well, then
So,
relationship building is so important as well. You can't, again, back to you can't be an island unto yourself, because you will need the expertise of other people inside the organization to effectively do your job.
Yep. So go out and find it. Again, whether you take a course, whether you talk to subject matter experts inside your organization or other things, read books, do something, right? Because not taking that lifelong learning approach and just constantly improving yourself and trying to get better, you will get left behind in the knowledge age. And that is the age that we are in right now. So, whew, good stuff. We could keep going, but we got to cut it short because I'm sure people have to get to work or they're done with their exercise for the day. So, Colleen, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me today. You've got some data now that actually proves some of the stuff that I've been talking about. And we'll try to, again, we'll link up in the show notes down below too, because you've left that survey open for that way. If anybody wants to go out, continue to do it and kind of get that benchmarking and kind of where you would sit on that maturity model so that you can kind of see where you're at. It gives you another point of reference, at least, to take a snapshot where you're at now and then be able to decide what you want to do to improve moving forward as well.
Yeah, and we continue to share information. So if you Google the Touchstone Research for Internal Audit, you'll find our webpage where there's links to some of the webinars where we dig into some of these topics in a lot more detail, some of our thought leadership, but also a link to take the survey as well.
Sweet. Okay, so we'll link that up so that people can find it easily. But thanks again for coming on and for doing the research, because like I said, it's a little bit of a different kind of research project than normally has been out there. So it's kind of exciting. I wanted to make sure that people got to hear the results, and I'm sure they can go download all the stuff off the website too. So thanks
for having me, Jason. This was fabulous.
You're welcome. And that's a wrap. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Jamming with Jason. Keep on rocking in the audit world. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you later on the next show. If you'd like to earn continuing professional education for listening to today's episode, head on over to C-Risk Academy at ondemand.criskacademy.com. and that's C as in the letter C, riskacademy.com. Not only do you get a CPE certificate, but you also will have access to the video version of today's show. The views and opinions expressed on this show are that of the individuals and not of their respective organizations.